Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. I'm Mark Labberton. Welcome to Conversing. I'm really delighted to welcome back to Conversing today Dr. Jemar Tisby. He's come onto Conversing several times and is a writer, a thinker, a speaker, a Christian, a brother in Christ, whose life and faith and work I greatly admire. His first book that landed him with tremendous public attention was the book called The Color of Compromise, The Truth About the Church's Complicity in Racism. Since that time, he's written several other books, including How to Fight Racism, The Spirit of Justice, True Stories of Faith. These reflect the kind of commitments that he has as a historian to draw us deeply into the past in order to set ourselves clearly in the present. And today, we've invited him onto Conversing specifically to talk about the Voting Rights Act decision by the Supreme Court of the United States last week. Jemar Tisby, it is always a delight to have you on Conversing. Welcome back.
The feeling is mutual. Good to see you again, Mark.
You know, Jemar, we come together on this occasion because of the recent decision by the Supreme Court about the Voting Rights Act. And I want us to talk about it, what it is, and then what this decision has meant and what caused it and how we understand it and where we go from here. But I'd like to start in a somewhat more personal way. We have watched this Supreme Court move in this direction, and John Roberts, the Chief Justice, has clearly indicated through previous decisions and other speeches and actions that he's taken that this was a goal of his to actually undo the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And I wonder if you could then, and knowing all that, which you did, then you know this decision is before them, you know that they're going to be making announcements about the outcomes. How did you just personally receive it? Where were you? How did it happen? And what were your immediate responses?
Thank you for asking that. As is often the case these days, I think I first heard about it over a group text message. Mm-hmm. So especially in these times, it's been critical to cultivate networks of connections and people who share our same concerns and also have different skill sets. And so this is a group of lawyers, of organizers, of clergy, of nonprofit leaders, all kinds of folks. And so it was really helpful to hear from their different angles and perspectives. But it was devastating. And one thing that I would love for your listeners to attend to is that this has landed in the Black community harder and heavier than a lot of what we've seen during the Trump administration. And that's saying a lot because, you know, the chaos that he has caused has been endless. But this is personal. And as a historian who is also Black, good night. The first thing I thought of was the march from Selma to Montgomery. And specifically, I thought of John Lewis, who, of course, became a longtime congressperson out of Georgia, but before that was the leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And it was in that capacity that he was on that march from Selma to Montgomery. And one of the quirky historical facts that sticks out to me about that is, of course, the police met the marchers with tear gas and batons. Well, John Lewis was hit so hard with a baton over the head that it cracked his skull. And what's remarkable about that to me is the skull is the hardest bone in the body. So the amount of force and viciousness that this officer of the law wielded that baton on peaceful marchers who, by the way, this whole thing started for voting rights. They were protesting for their voting rights. And that's what flooded my consciousness when I heard the news. In addition to all of this stuff is so infuriating because it is so backwards logically. There are so many holes in their reasoning and in the argument. It boggles the mind that folks sitting on the highest court in the land who've been to all these Ivy League schools, have literally decades of experience, can get it so wrong and stand so arrogantly on such faulty reasoning. And it's just like, if you're going to make a ruling like this, at least have some sort of sensibleness about it. Like give me something I can chew on and debate. Like, well, maybe you have a point there, but so many of these things beyond this ruling it's just foolish. It's just absolute foolishness.
I read the decision, and Justice Kagan makes the dissenting case that was voted on, supported by three of them, herself included. And she makes the same point that you've just made, which is that it is not only counter to history and to the precedent and to the legitimacy and the ongoing need for it, but secondly, this sense of retrograde steps that you're talking about, of reversing something that for which there is no real logic or case to be made, except the will and capacity to be able to do so. I think when I first heard this, I felt like I had gotten seriously kicked in the stomach. I mean, I sat down immediately. I remember I was standing up and I just fell into the chair thinking, this is such a dark day for America. And it undoes one of the most important things that has happened in the American civil rights movement. Really was the Voting Rights Act. It was among the very, very top tier of accomplishments that came about through that, in part because of that long march and the acknowledgement of the seriousness of what had happened, which is what motivated President Johnson to then be the one who urged Congress to write and sign a bill that would be passed and that he could sign in order to put it in place. I will say, just as a footnote, for those who are listening, there's an amazing a cappella piece that was done at Harvard in honor of John Lewis. And the piece of music that went into my mind was this choral piece, which we're going to put in the show notes. And I encourage you to listen and to feel what that moment felt like, and then consider again this conversation in light of the poignancy and the honor that was being shown to him by these Black students and by Harvard on that particular day. So for the sake of people who may not be tracking all that closely, they're thinking, what are you talking about? What's happened? Why are you so distressed by this? Just recount for us again what the Voting Rights Act is, how it's been challenged, but also largely really strongly sustained by Congress, but gradually undone by the courts. And now this big decision that's just been made last week. Just give us a recap.
First, for the folks listening, I want to make clear that this is about not just Black people. This is about all people. This is about all of our voting rights. This is about the basic, most fundamental voice of the people, which is the vote. And so it does strike in a very personal way the Black community, because we fought so hard for the Voting Rights Act in 1965. But understand that applied to all people. And so this ruling now applies to all people. There's a long, long history here. One, you can go all the way back to the Constitution and the 3/5 clause. And that was not that Black people were 3/5 of a person, as is frequently cited, but that for purposes of representation, they would count enslaved Black people as 3/5 of a white person. And this is, my mind went back to there as a historian, because this again is about representation in Congress. So this ruling is fundamentally about how do you draw congressional districts, but also it's any district. So this could be at the state level as well, but it's again about representation. So that's all the way back in the late 1700s. You fast forward to the 1850s and the Dred Scott v. Sanford case. And Dred Scott was an enslaved person. He and his wife were taken by their enslaver to free states in the North, like Wisconsin. Now, the rule is you cross over into a free state, you are now free. But that's not what their enslaver did. Enslaver kept them. So Dred Scott sued in Missouri, and case made it all the way to the state Supreme Court there, where it was struck down. But then he appealed all the way up to the Supreme Court, where in what lawyers frequently and widely recognize as the worst, if not, or one of the worst Supreme Court rulings, Judge Roger Taney said, I'm not even going to entertain the merits of this case about crossing into a free state or not. Here's the issue. You're enslaved, therefore you are not a person, you are property, therefore property can't sue. You have no rights. You can't bring a lawsuit. That's what he ruled on. And then just a few years later, we get the Civil War. The Civil War comes, and thankfully the Union won, and it led to the Reconstruction Amendments, 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, 14th Amendment establishing birthright citizenship, which sort of reverses Dred Scott, and it's also on the chopping block for this Supreme Court today. They are questioning, I think it was my own Senator Rand Paul, who just introduced legislation to strike down birthright citizenship. But remember, the original context was enslaved Black people who were born here and probably went back for generations. They are citizens just by being born here. And then you have the 15th Amendment, which was male suffrage, voting rights for Black men. And that should have been enough. First of all, it should have applied to women. Second of all, it should have been enough for Black men to vote. And for a short time it did. 1865, 1877, Reconstruction, a ton of Black folks elected to both federal, state, and local office. Everything from postmaster to, for a brief time in Louisiana, there was a Black governor. And then comes Jim Crow. And Jim Crow is characterized by segregation, and that's Plessy v. Ferguson in the 1890s. But it's also characterized by lynching, of course. But really, one of the main features of Jim Crow is disenfranchisement, voter disenfranchisement. So you went from this hockey stick-like increase of Black voter registration right after the Civil War to it absolutely falling off a cliff for the next almost 100 years. And that was because they got savvy and decided not to use race-based language. So they didn't have to say Black people aren't allowed to vote. What they did was say, well, you have to pay money to vote, a poll tax, or you have to take something called a literacy test, which is the poll worker gives you some obscure question based on the state or the federal constitution, and then they decide if you pass. Of course, it's completely subjective, and all these poll workers are white. And then they have something called the grandfather clause, which says you can vote if your grandfather could vote, which at that time meant, if you were Black, your grandfather's likely enslaved, so you couldn't vote, right? All these ways. I say that because what the Supreme Court today has done is essentially said, well, if people are not explicitly using race-based language to draw these congressional districts, then there's no need for the Voting Rights Act. They can draw them according to partisan lines, political or democratic. They just can't use race. But that's dumb, because they learned all the way back in the 19th century not to use explicitly race-based language, and then to use all these different codes to end up with the same result. Now, there's a lot more that I can and will say about that, but I want to pause here on the history lesson.
Right. Well, it's a gripping history lesson. This church that I worship at is Allen Temple Baptist Church in Oakland, California, and it's a Black church. And on Sunday, as Jacqueline Thompson, the pastor of that great church, was speaking, she had on a table before her a watermelon and a bowl of bubbles and jelly beans. And she said that she was describing these literacy tests and whether or not you were qualified to vote. And you had to be asked how many seeds are in this unopened watermelon, or how many bubbles are there in this bowl of bubbles, or how many jelly beans are in this. And that was meant to be the qualifying factor, which of course made it completely impossible and elusive and scandalously offensive that they would even have used them. But those were the kind of absurdities to which people went to avoid saying that it had anything to do with race.
100%.
It just made that a very vivid lesson
That
on
is
Sunday.
so powerful. I'm so glad she did that. We haven't even gotten to the Voting Rights Act. And so just to briefly recap that, it was passed in 1965, but of course it took years and years and years of activism to get there. Just in the civil rights movement alone, which you can trace to 1954, Brown v. Board, or maybe 1955 with the Montgomery bus boycott and the lynching of Emmett Till. So it took a decade of activism just during the civil rights movement, not to mention before, to get there. And then, as you mentioned before, it took this catastrophic event, that march from Selma to Montgomery. So it started in January of 1965, this push for voter registration and voter rights in Alabama. And it basically escalates. Conflict between activists in Selma and local law enforcement in Selma escalate to the point where a couple months later, there's a demonstration. Law enforcement comes down hard. They end up killing a black man named Jimmy Lee Jackson. Then here's where the church comes in, the black church comes in. They hold a meeting at a local church and they say, what are we going to do? And they say, we're going to take this struggle straight to the governor in Montgomery. And we're going to hold a march from Selma to Montgomery. And so that's what they do. About 600 people line up to march. And then as they cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge right outside of Selma, they're met by law enforcement, as I said, tear gas, batons. But what happens is there's journalists there, there's pictures and photographs and film. That goes the equivalent of viral in that day and causes this massive cultural, outrage. And so it was in that mix that LBJ says, okay, now's our chance. So he actually sends the bill to Congress, which is not that common, but he sees an opportunity there and he sends it through the Senate. There's this long filibuster by Southern senators, and then they eventually gets to the House. They pass it at the House. It's bipartisan. Some people obviously don't vote for it, but it's bipartisan. And then it goes across LBJ's desk. He signs it in the presence of people like Rosa Parks and MLK. And the reason why this was so huge, Civil Rights Act in 1963 was huge. But the Voting Rights Act in 65 was in many ways the culmination of the civil rights movement, because voting had always been sort of the holy grail of the movement. If we can vote, Black people said, then we can have a voice in how we're governed. Can you imagine racist, segregationist, white supremacists representing your interests with almost no recourse? Like you as a citizen, as a potential voter, you're eligible to vote, but you've been prevented in all kinds of ways. Those are the people representing you. So you can understand the importance of the Voting Rights Act, which said, okay, now we can elect people who understand us. Now we can elect people from our own communities. Now we can get people who are looking out for our interests, just as white folks have been doing for generations. And that's what it was about. It was about fairness. It was about everyone participating in this democratic project as it should be. And so this court, the Roberts Court, rolling back the key measures in the Voting Rights Act, and this isn't the first one, it strikes a blow to what was really a crowning achievement of the civil rights movement.
And it sends tremors across the nation, in not only in the chaos of gerrymandering and redistricting, but therefore the potential loss again of any representative vote. And if you read any articles that are out there, there are quite a lot of articles that are being written on this subject. But I think the thing that I think is important in many ways to understand is that what this is allowing for is that overtly, at least, race can't be part of any redistricting plan. And now they've shifted the language to racial impact to racial intention. So if you have a racist intention, which of course no one can really access in anyone else's heart and mind, then therefore it can only be measured by impact. And as long as it's cloaked in party language, then it's completely acceptable to the Supreme Court. It's just not acceptable at all if it's done in racist language. So they, of course, just studiously avoid that and make it an interior decision, not even an external one that has to do with the effects of racist behavior. It's no
So
wonder that the black world is in the United States and beyond is being so reactive to this particular moment, because it deserves every possible reaction.
there's a kind of a cheeky way of explaining or putting into words what you just said, and it's by a lawyer and a commentator named Elie Mystal, and he often writes for The Nation. And so this is what he wrote in a recent article that I just found so helpful. And he said, what this means in reality is that white people can gerrymander away black political power, just like they did in the old days, as long as they say they're only trying to take away democratic political power. It means that even if you can show that the gerrymander was obviously targeted to dilute the black vote and not the quote unquote democratic vote, it doesn't matter. Unless the white gerrymanderers say something like, I drew this map because I hate Negroes, or some other similarly vile statement bold enough to get Justice Alito excited, it means the Voting Rights Act is effectively dead. So that I just think is helpful. Like we can get so lost in the legalese of this, but it's really quite simple. What they've done is they've moved the goalpost. What used to be the case is that if you can demonstrate racist impact or racial disparities in terms of results, then you had a case. What this ruling has done is say disparate impact is not the measuring standard anymore. It's intent. It's what did they mean? So the analogy I use is let's say you get an offender bender, somebody rear ends you. Now you have to make an insurance claim. For insurance, all you really got to do is show the damage. Say, look, here's the bent fender, here's the tail light, we took pictures, here's the impact. But now what the court has done is say, that damage doesn't matter. What you have to show now is that the driver who rear-ended you meant to do it and targeted you because of your race. Now, if you can show that, yeah, you got a case. But who can show that? Because as we've already demonstrated back in the 1800s, the white power structure already knew, well, we can get around saying the word black or Negro or whatever and still get the same impact. And so they've moved that goalpost, and it makes it almost impossible. And this is not, so this is one section of the Voting Rights Act. They've already gutted another section back in 2013, Shelby v. Holder. Shelby is a county in Mississippi. So these are coming out of southern states, which is not coincidental. But what they ruled in that was they took away what they call pre-clearance. So there was a clause in the Voting Rights Act that said if you are a state that has a history of racially discriminating against voters, then before you make any changes to your voting processes or your maps, you got to send that up to the federal level and get approval and make sure this isn't racist. So back in 2013, the Roberts Court again ruled against the pre-clearance thing and took away pre-clearance. So then the South could just do whatever they wanted to, the white power structure. And so it's been a chipping away at the sections. And so that's also the insidious part, because you can say, well, the Voting Rights Act is still on the books. It's still, the law of the land. What are you mad about? Well, because they've gutted key provisions that rendered it effective.
Right. So, Jemar, what is your understanding of why Chief Justice Roberts, has so long hated the Voting Rights Act? Let's just assume best intent, etc. What does he articulate as the best intent and why this needs to be undone?
So this is one line that says it all, and this has been quoted from him time and time again. Justice Roberts often says, quote, "The way to stop discrimination on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race." The way to stop discrimination on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race. So it's a tautology here. What Roberts is alluding to is something that we might more recognize as the principle of color blindness. He's saying the law should be colorblind.
Because a lot of people are confused about what that term means and how it gets used.
We tend to think of colorblindness as virtuous, right? Because here's the logic, right? If this nation has been so racist toward Black people and other people of color, if they have discriminated on the basis of race, if they have excluded on the basis of race, then the solution is not to consider race anymore, not to see race. And what that means is, well, I'm just treating all people equally. That's what the intent behind it is. There's that word again, intent, right? But what is the impact? Colorblindness only works if you're starting from a level playing field. If there's not one group that's way ahead because of race or way behind because of race. But here's the thing. We are not starting from a level playing field. So what John Roberts wants to do, this goes all the way back to the 1980s when he's working for Reagan and then later H.W. Bush. And he's still got this mentality of the way to, solve racial discrimination is not to discriminate based on race. So what you're looking at here, Voting Rights Act passed in 1965. So what he's saying is within 15 to 20 years, the Voting Rights Act was all but irrelevant because the problem had been solved. Equality had been achieved. That's what Roberts is saying in effect. Now, 61 years later from the Voting Rights Act, he's still saying the same thing. But for Roberts, it's not new. He was saying that within a decade and a half, if not sooner, privately, right? We just have these records from the administration. So what he's saying is, oh, we fixed that race thing. It took 15 years. We're done with that. So we don't need then these key provisions. And so he's written opinion after opinion, paper after paper, touting this colorblind approach. Now, Justice Alito wrote the majority opinion, but, completely co-signed by John Roberts because it was saying the same thing. It was saying that these race-based remedies to racism are racist. That's what they're saying, which is wrong because if you have been negatively discriminated against based on race, you can't all of a sudden pretend like race doesn't exist. If you want to right that wrong, you actually have to positively discriminate based on race, meaning if these particular groups were disadvantaged, we have to focus on these particular groups and restoration and repair and making them whole. Well, how can you do that if you don't see color? How can you do that if you don't take race into account? So what this court, the majority court, so let's be specific here. These are 6 so-called conservative justices and then 3 liberal or dissenting, right? So it was these conservative justices who, many of which are Catholic, all of which are Christian, who rendered this opinion. And they're saying, the way to solve racism is not to talk about race, which is completely wrong.
It's really crazy making.
That's the word.
Because it feels as though it's just a social fiction, that social/legal fiction that they have written for themselves. I'm going to see reality in this particular way. And I have been trying to find, and I read the case and I read the findings. I read all that Alito had written, and I was offended really by the argument because it felt so lacking in substance, as you were saying, and it didn't seem to take the reality of lived experience in the world seriously. It felt like it was instead genuinely just a shifting of the deck chairs in a certain way for the sake of an outcome that was wanted. Now, I'm not claiming that only conservative courts do that. Liberal courts will do that too. So I'm not saying only one party plays that way. But I am saying that is not what we ideally would want from our justice system, which actually interacts with both theory and practice and lived experience in real-time ways. So I guess I'm just curious, if you were to try to read Alito's summary of the case that brought about this decision and the rationale for that, would you have any positive things to say about the case for dismantling the Voting Rights Act?
They want to have a time machine and travel forward into a future that hasn't happened yet, which is a future where, because of race-based remedies, we are on a more equal playing field. I mean, wouldn't it be great? Wouldn't we all celebrate if there was genuine progress made such that we didn't need all these safeguards? It's like wearing a cast, right? You break a bone, eventually it heals enough and gets strong enough, you can take the cast off. But what they want to do is cut off the cast before the bone is healed, which means it's actually going to potentially fuse back together in ways that are worse than the break. It'll leave you with permanent damage. So we would all love to be able to say we've made enough progress that we don't need these safeguards anymore. But I think it was Justice Kagan back in 2013 with the Shelby v. Holder decision. She put it in this way. She said, the decision is like saying you don't need an umbrella because you're not getting wet. The umbrella is the thing that's keeping you from getting wet. And you're saying, well, since I'm not getting wet, I don't need this umbrella anymore. Now you take it away and now you're getting wet again. So that's the kind of circular logic that this court is employing. And by the way, we have to take this in the totality of the context. These are not good faith actors. So this specific court case is called Louisiana v. Callais. Callais is a person, a white person, who's claiming not to be equally represented. And then he was also at January 6th. He was one of these ardent election deniers, passionate believer in the so-called big lie. This is not a regular citizen who says, you know what, something's just not right here. And, you know, I'm not eager or excited about this, but I think we need to explore this in court. That's not what's happening here. And by the way, also, what was happening in Louisiana, those districts were corrective and proportional. There are about 30% of the population in Louisiana is Black. There are 6 congressional districts currently. So proportional representation, or really equal, would be a third. So you had 2 districts with Black representatives and 4 with white representatives. So it was actually representative of the population. Now what they're going to do, which Governor Landry has already suspended primary elections, and there were mail-in votes already being cast. So it's highly irregular. And by the way, this is where our firsthand research helps. When you look at Governor Landry's executive order, the rationale, the statute that he used to justify postponing those elections was a state of emergency statute meant primarily for natural disasters. There's a clause in that statute, I read the statute, that says law enforcement and the National Guards can be called in to salvage equipment that hasn't been damaged. It's not for a Supreme Court ruling. It's for a hurricane. That's what Governor Landry used to postpone these elections. And so this is what I'm saying is, like, even if there is some sort of philosophical point to what the majority court might be saying, that quickly falls to the wayside when you consider the totality of the context, not good faith actors, not people wanting a representative democracy, but people wanting to consolidate power, which we call minority rule, not minority in terms of race, minority in terms of ideology, because most people don't want this. The majority don't want this. So if you can't win on the merits of what you believe, then you have to rig the system so that no one can get you out of office.
So this past week, I've spoken with many Black leaders, some academics, some pastors, some entrepreneurs, some people in business, trying to understand how are they responding to this in different parts of the country as much as possible. And certainly I've seen a grave sense of weight because of this decision, and then an urgency about acting. Now, I'm sure it'll take time to see how that's going to fully manifest itself. But how are you seeing things? How are you hearing people talk about this? Is there an activism horizon that you can see emerging? What is that? Is it legislative? Is it simply civil action, nonviolent civil action, or both? Just what are you seeing?
There's been a flurry of activity since this ruling was handed down. So there have been marches and protests, particularly in the hotspots like Louisiana, Tennessee, Alabama. These are all states that are, as soon as that ruling came down, their governors are working with their secretaries of state to redraw their districts. So they were ready. Like, the far right is in lockstep on this. They were ready to get into action as soon as the ruling came down. So there's been a flurry of activity there, public protests. I would say the main lever is the courts. And it has been that way throughout the Black freedom struggle. What we have often pursued are legal remedies to these injustices, because if we can change the law, particularly at the federal level, then we always have recourse in terms of suing when there's an injustice committed. So I would follow the NAACP. I would follow the LDF, the Legal Defense Fund, other organizations that are just kind of think tanks like the Brennan Center, BRENNAN, have been very helpful. Those are the sort of long-term, bigger strategic moves. Other than that, it is flooding the polls for midterms, because the only way with these sort of gerrymandered districts and their thumb on the scales, the only way to counteract that is such a big turnout that you sort of overwhelm them with numbers. Because the way they're rigging it right now depends on sort of average or low voter turnout. So you're going to see a lot of churches, particularly Black churches, with huge voter registration drives. You're going to see a lot of organizing activities to get people registered and then to the polls. You're going to see a lot of announcements about early voting or who's on the ballot or all of that kind of stuff, which we've needed to do anyway, but it's so much more urgent now because, if they get a supermajority, if they get the House and the Senate in midterms, we're just not going to have any of our standard political mechanisms that can really stop them. And so this is, in my view, our last political chance that if we don't take the opportunity and have this wave, then we're going to be stuck in essentially competitive authoritarianism, as they call it, for many, many years to come.
Mm. Jemar, we could talk about this forever, and you've given us a special time today to talk about it because it's been so urgent. I think I want to bring our conversation to a close with really simply the words of thanks for laying things out as clearly as you have, and to say that the activism that you've been at for many years and are continuing to be at as a historian, but also as a speaker and an activist in that way, I just think it's such an important voice that God's given you, and I thank you for being a steward of that and trying to exercise it as boldly and courageously and straightforwardly as you possibly can. I certainly want to be a partner with you and others in responding in this time. And I do find this a very, very alarming moment because it is such a grand reversal of a 60-year history that has been so profoundly undone. And it is not for the welfare of America that it's occurred. So this is going to fall out along all the standard lines of division and hostility that we've seen. But this feels to me like it's one that really lands close to the heart of God, not because of his political interests, but because of the way that what is at stake is ultimately human dignity and the value of every single person made in the image of God with full rights and appropriate responsibilities. And that includes the possibility in a democracy of voting. So thank you for being so helpful today and for summarizing the things that we really need to keep put forward. I hope people who are listening to this will continue to follow and as much as possible to really enter into what this moment is about for this reason, as well as many others that we might name. But tonight, this is the reason that we're talking about this. And I hope that you'll really act on what you've heard. Thank you very, very much.
Always such an intelligent, well-reasoned conversation with you, Mark. You calm me down a little bit in a good way, so I appreciate the conversation.
All the best, Jemar. Thanks so much. Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. Peter Labberton is our engineer and editor. Evan Rosa is our producer. For more information about Comment Magazine, visit comment.org, where you can subscribe, read the current magazine issue, and browse their archive. Fuller Seminary is an evangelical, multi-denominational graduate institution committed to providing indispensable formational education for diverse Christian leaders everywhere. For information, visit fuller.edu. I'm your host, Mark Labberton. Thanks for listening with me.